Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for being here, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to another webinar in our series presenting WorldFAIR project outputs. Today, we are talking about biodiversity and agricultural biodiversity. Very few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with you after the end of the webinar, and we will also publish it on our website and YouTube channel. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat during the presentations. There will be a Q&A and panel session at the very end, and all those questions will be addressed. A few words on our webinar series. So we've run 5 webinars so far. We started in May, and we are going up until May 2024. We are here today talking about biodiversity in agriculture, and we have 2 webinars, one webinar coming up in October and in November and in December. So we'll be hearing from urban health and population health, disaster risk reduction, and the cultural heritage and social surveys. We are going to start arranging new dates for 2024. So please keep checking our website. The link is here in my slides, and I will also put it in the chat after this presentation. So today, the first focus of this webinar is the case study on biodiversity, which sets out to consult with community members in the development of a new FAIR data model that encompasses long-term biodiversity monitoring data from newly developing biodiversity monitoring projects around the world. And the aim of this consultation is to identify improvements in data models and processes that could then in turn lead to improvements to the Darwin Core Standard and its implementation of FAIR principles. Our speakers today will speak about their first published report, their first published WorldFAIR report on data standards for sharing ecological and environmental monitoring data documented for community review, which describes this new data model being developed and led by GBEF in this case study. Next up, and our speakers, of course, to talk about biodiversity are John Miller and John Wieczorek from GBEF. Next up, we will hear from our case study on agricultural biodiversity, which was initially conceived within the RDA Improving Global Agricultural Data Community of Practice, or IGAD community, which identified initiatives related to plant pollinator data standardization and put together this team working on this case study. The case study works to ensure broad participation and alignment with other agricultural data initiatives at the global level to facilitate the implementation of the FAIR data principles. Our speakers will talk about their first published report on WorldFAIR, the agricultural-related pollinator data standards use cases report, which presents an overview of projects, good practices, tools, and examples for creating, managing, and sharing data related to plant-pollinator interactions, and presents a work plan for conducting pilots in the next stage of their work within the WorldFAIR project. Deborah Drucker from Embrava will give this presentation, and after Deborah, we will have a panel conversation and we will address your questions. Our speakers will discuss the GBEF unified model and plant pollinator data and how the 2 work packages connect. And our speakers will be joined by Tim Robertson from GBEF, Martin Treckles from Maize Botanic Garden, and Jose Augusto Salim from the University of Campinas. And that's me. The floor now is to my colleagues, and I believe Joe will introduce John, who will give an online record presentation, and will be here, is with us in the meeting to address any questions. So I will stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I just wanted to give a quick introduction from GBEF and welcome you. So GBEF is on a multi-year process in improving our data model, and it's been we've been working on this for a couple of years, and it's a long-term goal of ours to develop the data model, and really for 2 reasons. It's in part a response to the wonderful depth of knowledge of biodiversity data that is in the community, the global community, and we want to be able to share the richness of all that data as well as possible. But also there's in response to the biodiversity loss crisis that we're in the middle of now. And we really need this data to make the research and policy decisions to affect policy to help our biodiversity loss problem. So it's a very interesting issue from an intellectual point of view, but also a very serious issue as well, because we really need data in a model to make it active and useful for our communities. I appreciate this opportunity. We're part of leading work package 9 in the WorldFAIR grant. And we've had a series of seminars about the data model, and it's great to have this one in particular because I hope that we're reaching out to new members who haven't heard about the data model work, either via GBIF or through Deborah's work in Work Package 10. And I see quite a few people from the GBIF network, and I'm welcome others that are coming through CODATA and RDA connections. So with that, I just will introduce John's video. So John is leading this work. He has recorded a 15-minute video, and he introduces himself in the video, but you can see him on your screen, I hope, and he'll be around for questions afterwards. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video.
I'm going to share my screen to play the video. Once it starts playing, if someone can give me a thumbs up so that I know the volume is okay.
Hello, I'm John Wieczorek, convener of the Darwin Core Maintenance Group in the organization Biodiversity Information Standards, otherwise known as TADWIG. In this presentation, I'll try to put the current state of work on diversifying the GBIF data model into perspective, with a bit more detail on the general topic for today, which is biotic interactions. The first bit of perspective is to understand what the motivation and goals are for the diversification work. In brief, the motivation stems from the GBIF 20-year review in 2020, which recognized that biodiversity data is more complex than just the occurrences of organisms. And with such recommendations as 1, GBIF should continue to mediate and build upon the most comprehensive set of biodiversity data available, that GBIF should attain and share leadership in essential technologies and its standards, and that GBIF should deepen relationships within the broader community. A series of ensuing workshops resulted in a strategic plan that acknowledges the issues around the complexity of biodiversity data and identifies the need for accommodating more varied types of data. In response to the strategic plan, work began in July of 2021 with a contract to meet the convener of the Darwin Core Maintenance Group. The goal has been to investigate ways to expand the diversity of scientific questions that can be applied to GBIF-mediated data, and therefore, conversely, the diversity of scientific data that can be mediated by GBIF. The work began with a survey of high-level ontologies, conceptual frameworks, and databases that model physical entities and processes and the relationships between them. The results of that study, combined with a broad overview of communities of practice ready but unable to share data meaningfully, we arrived at an event-based conceptual model against which to test use cases. The original use cases were each chosen to represent a broader family of similar cases within distinct subdomains of biodiversity science. Each additional case has been chosen to highlight a novel challenge that can't be fully satisfied by the modeling that has gone before it in our work. Here's a sampling of some of the use cases identified as examples in distinct biodiversity subdomains for development and testing. This is not an exhaustive diagram. The first step in the use case approach is to identify a challenge for data aggregation that no other use case covers. If we, that is Tim Robertson and I, don't have enough knowledge of the real-world problem ourselves, we solicit an expert narrative that explains the challenges and the goal for addressing it in the words of that expert. Then we interpret the expert narrative into a summary narrative, explaining it in terms of the unified model and presenting it in a consistent way using a use case template. Here's an example of the summary narrative for the original biotic interactions use case. I don't mean to go into this in any detail just now. I just want to give you an idea of what these summary narratives look like. The summary narrative contains the interpreted description of the problem, as I said, which we use to adapt the conceptual model to enable the new capability. One view we use of the unified model is an entity relationship diagram, which allows the model to be readily understood in terms of being implemented as a relational database. This view helps us to explain the structure and to test real data in a database context. Another way we view the unified model is as a knowledge graph that shows the relationships between the concepts and helps to visualize the stories inherent in the data modeled in this way, and to understand the questions that can be asked if the data are available. The next and most challenging step is to try to find the right simplification of the unified model into a data publishing model. The principles behind this step are, for a particular family of use cases, to A, minimize obstacles to data publishing based on unnecessary complexity and irrelevant parts of the unified model. B, minimize obstacles to data publishing based on insufficient depth, such as structure, richness, such as available fields, or semantic rigor. And C, to support the most diverse possible set of scientific questions in balance with the two preceding principles. Getting this right requires extensive testing with real data and the people who know them. The process is iterative both within and between use cases at all steps of development. We're constantly checking the implications on the unified model of integrating additional use cases. The idea here is that when we reach the point of proposing a publishing model, there's nothing missing in the unified model that was not specifically identified as needed in a use case, and there's nothing in the publishing model that hasn't been tested and found sufficient for the identified needs. I'd like to give you a visual idea of what we mean by creating a simplified data publishing model for a family of use cases. Here's an image of the core part of the unified model, that is, without the auxiliary so-called common tables, as an entity relationship diagram again. The image shows the parts of the unified model that pertain to the material collections use cases, which are bordered in red. Don't worry about any details. This is just to give you a visual impression of complexity. There are 11 tables with 18 connections involved in the relevant part of the unified model for this family of use cases. Now, here are the relevant concepts regrouped and simplified in a provisional data publishing model for material collections. There are 4 tables and 11 connections. The number of fields, that is the richness, in both the unified and data publishing models would likely be roughly the same. The data publishing model is meant to be as close as possible to a common view of the way the data publishers understand their own data. Here is a list to give you an idea of use cases on which we've advanced the most so far. The use cases selected draw from our experience collected through many channels, including the GBIF Help Desk, network engagement activities, involvement in standards development through TADWIG, and ongoing global consultations, such as that for the digital extended specimen. Shown here are some use cases that are well advanced. I won't explain these in any detail, but I would like to point out some of the few interesting highlights. The collection management systems family of use cases covers collecting events, the collected material, the identification of organisms and associated digital objects, including media and genetic sequences. This was also the first work on some types of biotic relationships, such as wholes and parts, hosts and parasites, duplicates, parents, offspring, and siblings. The camera trap use case was a close collaboration with the community already in the process of developing a targeted data sharing standard for monitoring areas with triggered series of images in which organisms, and sometimes even identifiable individuals, can be determined through expert and AI approaches. The result was to enable CamTrap frictionless data packages to be published directly with the integrated publishing toolkit. Like with camera traps, the environmental DNA use case seeks to enable a community with tools to format and publish data as close to the way it is already handled as possible. This includes hierarchical events and site sequence matrices. The ecological inventories family of use cases have been developed in close collaboration with the Humboldt Extension for Ecological Inventories task group of TADWIG. Also using the hierarchical event structure, this work entails the declaration of taxonomic and organismal scopes against which absences of detection can be inferred and abundances can be estimated. The phylogenetic trees use case covers links between specimens, sequences, material citations, and phylogenetic trees with the objective of enabling phylogenetic-based search and discovery. This is in a preliminary testing phase. The first three of these have already been the subjects of webinars in the same series as the webinar today. Once we have advanced a use case sufficiently, we present the background of the project and our work to date to increase public awareness and solicit further engagement. Today we're giving the fourth in the series sponsored by GBIF, and this time it's to update you on biotic interactions. Our second foray into biotic interactions after the types of relationships covered previously in specimen collections began with this use case taken from the literature, in which host butterflies were sometimes parasitized by a wasp, which in turn were sometimes hyperparasitized by another wasp, where the hyperparasitism potentially was affected by the presence of an endosymbiont bacteria in the parasitoid. This example was exciting because it dealt with several levels of relationships between individuals of multiple taxa. Here's a simple table depicting just the primary information about the relationships observed. The rest of the story, such as the information about locations, events, people involved, methods, etc., are covered in a variety of other use cases and aren't novel here. What we're trying to capture is the chain of relationships associated with an individual organism, the butterfly, whose identifier is MC1. It's an instance of a taxon whose scientific name is Melitia cinchia. There are some interesting things to note here, even beyond who's doing what to whom. The first is that these are interactions that record organisms on both sides of the relationship, whether or not the individuals on either side are retained as evidence. In other words, these are not taxon-level assertions. They are primary data on individuals. The second interesting thing highlights a question that's not been fully answered, and that is whether it's necessary to provide a record for each direction in a relationship. For example, would it be sufficient to include only row 1, MC1 parasitized by HH1, and from that infer that HH1 parasitized MC1, which is given explicitly in the table as row 2? Even if it is sufficient for this particular relationship, would it be so for all possible relationships? The third interesting thing is the clear importance of well-defined vocabularies for the relationship type. In order to make meaningful use of aggregated data from distinct data sets, it's going to be critical to use controlled vocabularies with rigorous definitions. None of what I have just said is a surprise to the TADWIG Biological Interactions Data Interest Group, who've worked on solutions for sharing these kinds of data using Darwin Core archives. I won't go into all the work done by the Biological Interaction Interest Group here, except to say that their solutions using the Darwin Core events, resource relationships, and measurements or facts are consistent with the events, entity relationships, and assertions of the unified model. The biggest differences are that the entity relationships and assertions are somewhat more expressive, and that they are not constrained by the one-level deep structure of the Darwin Core archive star schema. Here's our ER diagram again, this time highlighting the parts of the unified model that pertain to biotic interactions. Though we haven't done any appreciable testing on real data so far, we expect that the core of the data publishing model, without the material and digital evidence parts, will look something like this. The idea is simply that individual organisms are detected as participating in some relationship during an interaction event at some place and time. To the right, inherent in this and all publishing models, are the auxiliary tables that allow every one of the other tables to have agents with particular roles, assertions such as measurements, citations, and alternative identifiers. In early November, I'll have the honor of hosting José Salim. Somewhere in the mountains in the Patagonian spring, we're going to rigorously review the work to date and refine the unified and data publishing models based on trying to map a wide variety of interactions data sets. Thank you for your attention. We sincerely believe that the upcoming work to refine the unified model for biotic interactions data will be fruitful and that it'll have a broad impact on a number of new communities.
Okay, so thank you, John, for this recorded presentation. And it's really exciting. I'm going to to share my screen. My name is Deborah Drucker. I am the WorldFAIR case study on agricultural biodiversity lead. I'm a data manager at Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation. And I'm really thrilled to be here in this webinar today to discuss our collaborations between WorldFAIR package and beyond within the WorldFAIR project and within the biodiversity sciences. So as Alex mentioned in the introduction, our case study was born within the IGAD community of practice. This is one of the groups within the Research Data Alliance. And we detected that many of our collaborators were working with plant pollinator data. And we brought together a few of them to work in this challenge. I will try to convince you that's not simple, but we are, I think, managing to advance. So Embrapa is the lead, and we also have the Mais Botanic Garden. We have our partners from Mais here in Belgium. We also have our partners from CAURO, the Kenyan Agriculture and Livestock Research Corporation, as partners. And HiveTracks, which is a startup that works with beekeepers. And we have many other partners worldwide. We have, as an example, Jeff Allerton here, which is a researcher in plant pollinator. We have the Brazilian network on plant pollinator interactions data, HEBIP, and I will talk a little bit more about them in a while. And also I'm reusing some of their slides. So why we chose this, why it's so important to mobilize data for plant pollination. So I know many of us in the audience here are aware of that, but as in WorldFAIR, we are tackling cross-domain science. There might be people that are not aware of the importance of pollination for flowering plants. So pollination is a major, is of major importance for the reproductive system of angiosperms. And the majority of the flowering plants are animal pollinated. So if we continue to observe the decline of pollinators as we are going to have a serious reduction on seed production, and also most of the terrestrial ecosystems may function. One on 10 described terrestrial vertebrates and intervertebrates may function as pollinators. So the point here is that it's really important for the maintenance of life on Earth. And it's also important for agricultural production, and that's why this is related to a community of practice of data in agriculture. So we have this estimative of 75 of the most productive crop plants are animal pollinators. And this is similar to what we had in the Brazilian platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, also estimated that 76% of the plants used for food production is dependent on this so important ecosystem service. So we can see that most of the sustainable development goals really are rooted in this kind of interaction, which is plant pollination. And that's also why one of the first assessments of the IPBES, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, was on pollinators, pollination, and food production. And one of the main findings by then is that there are major data gaps. So that's why we convene experts from all the world to work with the main objective of ensuring fair data for understanding plant-pollinator interactions at biologically relevant scales for a crop. We just finished the discovery phase. Alex has already shared in the chat the link to it. And we perform a landscape analysis on plant pollinator data practices worldwide. And we collected use cases and also developed work plans for the pilots, which is the phase that we are going through right now. We are conducting the pilots, and we are going to develop best practices and guidelines recommendations. We are also estimating costs of adoption of the standards, and we are adapting fair data rubrics for pollination data. So the report is here. You will find much more information about our findings in the document. And in summary, we discovered that a huge amount of data on plant pollination is in supplementary files of research articles. And most of the ones that we found are lacking fairness in many aspects. Data formats, lack of semantic resources, need to read the paper to really understand the data, which requires expertise. And sometimes the data is not available because the journal is not open access. So we highlight in the report, deliverable 10.1, that this is a real challenge for many actors, for researchers, data administrations, editorial boards, and publishers, and scientific societies. And now in the pilot phase, we are working with our partners for the standards adoption. I will describe a little bit more what we are doing, but the pilots are the plant pollinator data collection that Carol has made in the African continent. We have also several data sets from the Brazilian plant pollinator interactions network, and that's really interesting because there is data more focused on conservation and native areas. There is data also on crops. So our approach for agriculture is that we also need to consider data on non-crop ecosystems because they maintain the ecosystem service. So we are approaching a large realm of possibilities here. We also have partners in Argentina with observations of plant pollinator interactions in the Pampean region. They are also here in the call today, and they are doing a really nice work on the data cleaning and processing. And there is also data related to crop production here. We are also working with Hytrax, which is a startup that works with beekeepers. I think they are also here today, and we are working with the data they collect through the application. So this is really nice to have also a data-driven solution and real-world application for us to become closer to the decision-making. And also, we are talking to the USDA Agricultural Research Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they are probably going to be a pilot too. So we are having some conversations, and I hope they will join so we can have an even larger network of cases. So our approach for the data standardization is mostly based on this article led by José Salim, who is also here today and will be at the panel. This is also something that has some relation with the TEDWIG Biotic Interactions Working Group. So in this article, we propose a data model which is very much similar to the GBIF one, and that's what I think we are going to go deeper into the discussion and further work between our work packages. So any interaction is composed by three basic components: the occurrence, the encounter, and the outcome. So to allow more effective data aggregation and analysis, these three components should be properly documented. So we call the tetraanonymous is the encounter. So we have the two organisms, usually the two species. Sometimes it's not so, it's not determined at this level, but we have the two binomials and then the interaction type. And what we really observe are the events. So we can observe, for instance, the flower visitation, and we can observe the outcome. And we need as much as snapshots as possible to really understand the processes. So that's why we need to go and advance on this data standardization. So our approach is using the Darwin Core event class. So we have the interaction represented here, and then we can express the details of the interactions in the measurement of FAC part extension. So we can describe the effects and outcomes here. And then we have the tetranomial represented in the two occurrences. So we can describe the plant details in measurement of fact here, and we can describe the animal detail here in the other animal measurement of fact, all related to the occurrences. And then we have the interaction type and direction in the resource relationship extension. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because Joe already described. So we found that the GBIF model is really similar to what we are proposing here. The publishing model also, we can see the event core here. So we are working with the model and also with the vocabulary. And that's also described in the article that Jose led. And we are proposing this plant-pollinator interaction vocabulary to document the organism traits, the plant and the animal, and also the interaction itself. So basically, in a nutshell, that's what we are doing in the pilots. We are also working a lot on the taxonomic data cleaning. Oh, and I forgot that we have 48 terms in this plant pollinator vocabulary to be used with measure and type. And we are also now together with the other efforts in the WorldFAIR project working on converting this to the OWL format. So I'm finishing my talk here. We are working with this schema I presented. We have foreseen in a near future closer approach together with GBIF with the unified data model. We are also working on advancing semantics, and also we have the aim of collaboration with GLOBI. GLOBI is the Global Biotic Interactions platform. It's not only plant pollinator, and this, although of course the vocabulary is more dedicated to plant pollinator, the biotic interactions model it should work for any kind of interaction. So John described very well for parasite, and there are many possibilities for other interactions as well. But coming back to our WorldFAIR case here, we are more focused on the plant pollinator itself, and there are possibilities of also interacting with other work packages like the chemical one, because some of our data also collect nutrient contents of the fruits. So we foresee that in the near future, we are going to work more with the cross-domain interoperability framework and align with other partners to really promote this data interoperability also in interdisciplinary sciences. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to our discussion now in the panel.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks to our speakers. So we can kickstart our panel conversation, and I have two questions for Deborah, and perhaps others can also chime in if they want to. So first question is from Oksana, and the question is, do you consider pollinators in urban landscapes or only agricultural ones?
Yeah, so we consider that the ecosystem service of plant pollination is it's happening everywhere, and we also have urban agriculture. So we also consider the urban landscape, and the data model should work for any landscape. We don't really have a pilot on data on an urban ecosystem, but you will see in our report that we talk a lot about iNaturalist, which is a citizen science platform for data. and mostly observations data, and there is a huge amount of data on urban ecosystems there as well. I see that Quentin is here. He's also fond of iNaturalist, and it's a major resource for this kind of data.
Thanks, Deborah. Would anyone like to add anything, or should we move on to the second question? No? Okay, so the next question from Emmanuel: is there also a reference for the quote, interactions are processes, but we observe events?
Yeah, I think the reference is in the slide. I will paste it here.
Thank you. Next question. Is it so that the PPI schema will be integrated with Darwin Core? Question from Oksana. Who would like to take this?
Well, I hope so. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, the plant pollinator interaction, it's more a vocabulary to be used with Darwin Core. Probably the best approach is to use the vocabulary as a controller vocabulary for Darwin Core measurement of fact extension. So we are proposing a schema to based on Darwin Core, because when we started this process, even before the unified model have been proposed, we tried to provide a solution for people to share plant-pollinator interactions, even beyond interactions, using Darwin Core. But the vocabulary, the plant-pollinator interaction vocabulary, is to use with Darwin Core. It's not something that can be integrated. Of course, it can be. Darwin Core now has plenty of controller vocabularies, and probably plant-pollinator can be one of them, but it's more to use together and as a controller vocabulary for Darwin Core.
Thanks, Jose.
Can we move on to the next question? So, next question by Juliana. How can one institution participate in new pilots? For instance, by using not already published data, although descriptions of the entire pollination ecology system will be published in wild ecosystems. Those interactions involve scents, pollinators, plants, parasitoids, etc.
Hi, Juliana. Please drop me an email, and we can see if it's possible to also accommodate your case. Thank you for your interest. We don't have much time to work on the pilots because the next deliverables are due early next year. So we really need to decide before the end of this month, but we can discuss, and I think it's important to mention that we are working with data that's in many different situations, data that's already published, data that's for some reason is still restricted. So if it's not already published, we can also discuss that.
Thanks, Deborah. Next question from Sagar. In Darwin Core, if interaction types are to be added, what kind of interaction types can we expect? Is it the same as we can see in GloBE? Who would like to answer, Sagar, from our panel?
I can say something about that from the perspective of process. It's not a decision of Darwin Core or anybody who maintains it to do anything. It's actually a community-driven process to make change. And so, like in the question of the PPI, whether or not it becomes a Darwin core vocabulary, maintained, defined, etc., within that standard, is a matter of what the community decides and spends the effort to do. So I can imagine, having seen what I've seen so far, that the number, the plethora of types of possible interactions is even beyond what we see in any one source right now. And that I imagine that a reasonable way forward to managing capabilities is to have disciplines work on and maintain those vocabularies for themselves. And then from the Darwin core side, make recommendations about what vocabularies to use in order for data aggregated, for example, by GBIF, to make sense across multiple data sets or even multiple disciplines. So it's a technicality. Darwin core isn't going to make a vocabulary for those things, but it's going to facilitate the use and recommendation of vocabularies developed by communities who understand exactly what's needed and communicate with others who do more or less the same thing.
Thanks, John. Next question. Do you have any specific recommendations for using observation fields on iNaturalist to capture interactions, as there seem to be so many fields?
So in the browser version of iNaturalist, there is a field for documenting interactions. I think maybe Quentin or Martin know more about that than myself. Would you like to complement?
I don't know exactly which fields should be recommended to use. It's also kind of community created. So if you use a wrong field, typically someone can jump in and say, okay, for this kind of interaction, you better use another one. I don't have an exact list of what are the preferred ones. I don't know if someone else has.
No. Okay, Tim, you're unmuted. Would you like to come in? Yes.
I can see that my question was coming next, and to save you reading from me, I thought I would do it. One of the things that John and I are very conscious of is we have focused on, put our emphasis on data publishing models, trying to look at the kinds of data people are collecting and put it into the best possible shape with the assumption that people can reuse it. We're aware that we need to move into a stage of looking at the kinds of questions researchers are going to want to ask of these data, not just within one data set, but across many data sets, for example, through GBIF or OBIS or some other aggregator. I'm curious if the agricultural group have followed a similar approach to us, focusing on data publishing, or if you've had some kind of systematic approach to look at the kind of questions you think researchers are trying to address, perhaps across multiple data sets. And if you have any advice for us, really.
As much of the data, most of the data that we worked in the discovery phase are, as I said, supplementary files to articles. So they are mostly, they are tailored for the questions that are being asked in the article. And that's why it requires expertise to understand it. So I believe that the major challenge is to mobilize this data for reuse in a way that it's understandable, interpretable from anyone. So I don't have a real suggestion right now. I think it's a major point for the WorldFAIR project as a whole to really develop some approaches on this, the questions, especially the cross-domain questions. But in short, we are focusing on standardizing and publishing the data too. But perhaps our source data is more tailored for questions, so that can help somehow. I didn't think about collecting the questions. That would have been interesting too.
No, and if I can make a comment on this. So in our report, we took the route of trying to look at as many data sources as possible by doing big data searches. And to be able to analyze each of these would require a lot of manual effort. So we extracted what we could from the metadata, but since a lot of these are either in very inaccessible formats like proprietary formats or even images, it's not so easy to extract that in an automated way. So if we really want to go down to the questions itself, that will require quite a bit of manual effort as well. And as Deborah said, input from experts.
Thanks, thank you. Do we have any more questions from our attendees? I think we have addressed everything in the chat. You can also raise your hand and speak up if you'd like. We have 6 minutes left. No more questions in the chat. I wonder if we can perhaps address how the work that you are doing in your work packages in agricultural biodiversity, how does your work and your outputs relate to the rest of the WorldFAIR case studies and domains? Would anyone like to address that?
I can jump in quickly.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, I think it's a good use case for the CDIF, as because the cross-domain interoperability framework between agriculture, biodiversity, and biodiversity, because the fields are so closely related already. So it's a first step in creating a crosswalk across other work packages within WorldFAIR. So whatever we can do to make interoperability happen here will inform, I guess, the broader steps that are needed across disciplines that are further apart in their standardizations and their data. That's kind of, I see it's kind of a step approach. And this interaction is helpful with that first step.
We also have a work package on ocean data and marine organisms, and one thing that we foreseen is that the interactions in this work package are also a possibility that we can have some collaboration. I mentioned the possibilities with the chemical work package, and I think it makes sense to believe that it will, in many other work packages, the chemical part makes sense, because many of us are collecting data on chemicals in some way. There is a discussion on what is a chemical, and that's another story, I think. And I think that in the disaster part, there might be also an opportunity. And the cultural heritage work packages also has a lot of relation with the collections, the museums, and so that's also something that we have been talking about, how to collaborate.
Thank you both. 2 minutes left. Is there anything else that our panel would like to address at this time? Or our audience? No, nothing. In this case, I think we can finish. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our panelists, and thanks very much to our attendees for being here.